Hello, everybody. Welcome to the online YouTube lesson in which I walk and talk you through the topic Germany 1871 to 1932. Hopefully, you've received the Padlet materials and the message which I put up on Sunday evening, and you've got the mind map in front of you. And I'll walk and talk you through the content of the lesson. There's our big picture. So as you can see, if I just zoom in there, I think in total we've got 13 lessons on Depth Study 3, which is looking at specifically the Nazi revolution. Hitler and the Nazis were in power for 12 years from 1933 to 1945, but specifically we're looking here in this depth study at the years in which Hitler turned his chancellorship into a dictatorship. So the first 3 years of his rule in which he consolidated his power. So that's the focus of it. But we've then got, as you can see beneath there, 8 more lessons in which we sort of veer mainly over to the breadth study, section C, where we will look at the whole 12 years, 1933 to 45, to build up a further picture in terms of the development of society and the development of the German economy, which is what section C is about. Okay, so moving. Because we're beginning a new depth study, it's obviously a good opportunity for you to have a look at the typical questions that you could be asked in the examination. Those in red, as you can see, are section A questions, and if you actually look at the bottom there, it tells you a lot of these are taken from the revision guide and the textbook, but as you can see, the papers have been examined 3 times, and in both 2017 and 2018, the Nazi topic was in section A. And also the Nazi topic was examined in section B last year in 2019. And there's lots of other examples, model answers and etc., all in black there, section B type questions that you can pick up from the specimen papers or from the mark schemes, chief examiner's reports, etc., but also the revision guides. So make sure you do pick up on that. I've already spoken at length about indicative content and chief examiner's reports, and obviously you can do that for the 2017, 2018 and 2019 papers. Chief examiner's reports, remember, have got scanned answers for you to look at. Okay. A bit of information for you here on the slideshow about the type of questions that you could be asked if it appears in section B. So if you look at the questions 1, questions 5, 6 and 9, and you may want to pause here. I'll just pull back a little bit so you can actually see them. Okay, but they're on your slideshow. As you can see, many questions are about the nature of the Nazi revolution. Okay, the actual nature of the revolution, in particular, the issue of was it a legal revolution? Okay, so in other words, Hitler creating his dictatorship, turning his chancellorship into a dictatorship, and also a bit like with the German Revolution of 1918 to 1919, that sort of issue about change. How much did Germany really change? Was it a revolution, or was that a bit of a misnomer? Was it more of an evolution? Then you've got another type of question is about the power of the Third Reich. Was Hitler all powerful, or was he actually a weak dictator? You can see these in questions 2, 7, 8, 10 and 15. Or, and related to that, questions about efficiency. Was the Nazi state appeared to be very, very efficient, but in many ways that was a propaganda image that was created, and actually there's a lot of evidence to show that it was a very, very inefficient system. See, they're quite common questions. And then you've got questions about the popularity of the Nazis, and they tend to be along the lines of, was Hitler's power based on genuine popularity? In other words, his power came from the fact he was popular with many ordinary Germans, or were other factors more important, that people were just pretending to support Hitler, and actually things like fear were the basis of his power, and it's being able to engage with that. And then, as you can see, the questions in red are where it's been a Section A type questions, and you can sort of see 3, 4, 14 and 16 there. So we'll move on. And there are the questions again, okay, just presented slightly differently. They're on the slideshow. So what we're doing here is 3 lessons. We don't really begin the content of Depth Study 3 until we've done these 3 lessons. These 3 lessons that we're doing now, so starting today, today's lesson is so I'll change the colour of the pen. Blue on blue doesn't really work. So today's lesson is the sort of outer ring. It's like a Venn diagram. We're looking at the bigger picture of Germany 1871 to 1932, which basically means today's lesson we're going to cover a lot of what we've already covered, because we've been doing this since we started the course in September. But then the next 2 lessons, and as I did say in my message, I will try to do these this week. But the next 2 lessons will look specifically within this big picture at Hitler and the Nazis and how they fitted into it, and we'll spend 2 lessons on that. So your flip learning for today's lesson, which is the outer ring, was to go to Richard Evans. Hopefully you've done this, and to read the prologue of his second book, The Coming of the Third Reich, in this prologue he summarises his first book, which is called The Coming of the Third Reich. Okay, so his second book's called The Third Reich in Power, and the prologue of The Third Reich in Power, he summarises his first book, and it's a really, really useful chapter because it's a great historian summarising the key points from his point of view. So in the opening section of the prologue, pages 2 to 7, he focuses in on Germany 1871 to 1932, and he writes basically 6 paragraphs. And the first is about Bismarck's Germany, the strengths, then he looks at the weaknesses, then he looks at World War I, then he looks at the years of crisis, then he looks at the social fragmentation 1919 to 32, and then he looks at the violence and the rise of the extreme right wing. So the point of this lesson is just really to sort of make sure you're clear about what the key points Evans are making. But I say a lot of it is material we've already developed, and it's just simply a useful revision lesson. But nevertheless, there's a lot of very valuable new points. So it's a great consolidation lesson, this. And then, as I say, the next 2 lessons, we continue with the same prologue, but I want you to read the second half of that chapter. What he does is he focuses in on the middle bit, the rise of Hitler and the Nazis. And there are 7 paragraphs in that second part of the chapter. And those 7 paragraphs are all listed there. And we'll take 2 hours, 2 lessons to develop this, each of these, because there's a lot to talk about. It may only be 5 pages of his book, but there's a lot in there. So we won't rush it. We'll do it over 2 lessons. And that'll be the second half of this week. Okay, so there's the mind map. And we'll begin by focusing in on this. There's a lot to map there, if you have a look at it. The strengths and weaknesses of the Second Reich, and then World War I. So we'll actually break it down into 2 bits. Okay, so, and as always, this is the strengths and weaknesses of the Second Reich. I've done a summary for you in a nutshell. So I'll just read through this with you. So some historians have argued that Hitler and Nazism had its roots deep in Germany's past. That to understand Hitler and the Nazis, and obviously Hitler didn't take power until 1933, but to really understand Germany and why Hitler took power, you've actually got to delve way back to 1871 and the German Empire. And these historians argue that the Second Empire provided the soil, the fertile soil, in which the seed of Nazism was able to grow and eventually take power. So the argument is almost in a sense that the rise to power of Hitler was part of an inevitable process, because the fertile soil for the growth of Nazism had been prepared way in advance. Now, Evans actually disagrees with that point of view. Okay, but nevertheless, in his chapter, he does consider and he concedes that aspects of this argument are true. He does say, look, there were certain deep-rooted features from the Second Empire which did play a part in putting Hitler into power, but ultimately he argues to the contrary. He says he disagrees with them. He says it's not that simple, okay, that to suggest that the rise to power of Hitler was inevitable is too simplistic. So he doesn't agree with that point of view. He says it was not inevitable. It wasn't bound to happen. But to really understand Hitler, you've also got to look at the 1920s and 1930s, and history could have taken a different course. Okay, so what I've done here is I've modelled for you. Here are my notes, okay, on the right. So they're my notes, and I've signposted on the left where those points came from, and I've suggested that's a useful sort of model, a useful approach that you should be doing. Okay, so on the subsequent slides I haven't put the arrows in, and I've suggested you try to map those across yourself. Okay, look for where the points are being made. Okay, so pretty much I've said that in a nutshell. There's the common interpretation. Nazism had its roots in Germany's past. Evans talks about the militarism of the Second Reich. Okay, you know that. Okay, that Germany was created by the Prussian war machine. Nazism had militaristic characteristics. It valued war. It was very authoritarian in its approach, like the army. And that's the sort of second point, is that, of course, the Second Reich was very anti-democratic. It valued a dictatorial type approach, strong leadership from above, which, of course, is what Nazism was in part about. So there's the idea of this continuity between the Second Reich and eventually Hitler's Germany, which was called the Third Reich. But Evans, remember, rejects that interpretation. He does here point out certain weaknesses with that view. And one of his main weaknesses is he says it actually, although you can jump on the fact that the Second Reich, the Bismarck's Germany, was undemocratic, in many ways it was more democratic than Britain at that time. Yeah, one man, one vote. Every man over the age of 25 had an equal vote. That was different from Britain, okay, where it was very much based on property and wealth. And Evans's argument there is that therefore, why didn't fascism, why didn't right-wing dictatorship take root in Britain? Okay, so it's not that simple. Okay, and a kind of related point is that actually, again, the largest political party, which was the voice of the majority of Germans, the sort of like largest, the voice of a substantial proportion of the German people in the Second Reich, was the SPD. They got 110 seats in 1912. They were the largest party. Well, the SPD, what does the D stand for? It stands for democracy. They strongly believed in democracy. So those historians who kind of like put a great deal of emphasis on the fact that the Second Reich was not very democratic are kind of like selecting points to try to argue a case that they've already made their mind up, that Nazism had its roots in a very undemocratic past. Well, actually, it's not that simple, is the point that's being made there. Okay. So they, as I said, I've kind of modelled there what you should be doing, and the subsequent slides have actually done that. Okay, so you don't see the arrows there, but you may want to pause and look for where these points are being made as I go through. Okay. So the next aspect then is, okay, so Evans kind of like unpicks this, and he agrees there were, yes, some features of the Second Reich, some features undoubtedly. Remember, the Second Reich was Germany 1871 to 1918, the Germany of Kaiser Wilhelm I and Wilhelm II, okay, which did play a part ultimately of putting the Nazis into power. Sorry, I lost my screen a bit there. It's gone a bit funny. Hopefully it'll all be working okay now. So what were those features? Okay, so what are the key things? First of all, the upper classes, the entrenched power of the upper classes. We know about that, the Prussian Junkers. Okay, now you will be learning in the next two lessons how Hitler was put into power by the Prussian Junkers. So the fact that the Junkers were able to put Hitler into power, that comes back to the Second Reich, that the Junkers were powerful from 1871 onwards. Another factor that helped Hitler into power was big industrialists. They were big backers of the Nazi Party and helped put Hitler into power. Okay, so again, we know that that was a big feature. Sammlungspolitik, the alliance of steel and rye. Another feature, okay, we know that when Hitler took power, that he wanted to limit the powers of the Reichstag. We know that from the Second Reich, the Reichstag was had relatively limited powers. So there's the continuity with the past. We know that Catholics and socialists, Hitler hated them. Okay, again, you'll be learning about that, but Hitler, absolutely, in particular the socialists, but also the Catholics, because they were international. Okay, well, we know that Bismarck likewise attacked Catholics and socialists. The Kulturkampf attacked the Catholics, his anti-socialist laws of 1878. So there's continuity. And we know that in 1933, when Hitler took power, that the Catholics responded by trying to work with Hitler in the same way as they did with Bismarck. Remember, Bismarck and the Catholics eventually found a way of working together. We know that when Hitler took power in 1933, the SPD were surprisingly compliant. They hoped that they could work with Hitler. Well, that was very similar to the SPD in the Second Reich. Okay, so those behavioural traits to surface, lots of similarity. And the other one is these extremist parties who emerged from the 1890s onwards. We know that Nazism was an extremist movement that was born outside normal politics, that came from the streets. Well, we know in the 1890s, think about Weltpolitik, that there were pressure groups like the Pan-German League and the Agrarian League and the Colonial League that kind of like took a very radical, often violent view towards politics, often backed by the lower middle classes. And the Nazis were also backed from the lower middle classes. And many of those, we know that Hitler attacked the Jews as scapegoats. But likewise, many of these groups from the 1890s, you might want to go back to those notes on the building of a large navy, remember? But many of those sort of pressure groups also attacked the Jews as being scapegoats. So there are aspects of continuity. Apologies for my messy annotation there. I'm having a little bit of problem here on the screen with my pen. It's not working as well as it normally does. I probably need to do a reboot of my iPad, but I can't do that mid-video, so we'll just have to manage for this one. Okay, so there's the summary of that first half of Strand 1. Now the second half of Strand 1 looks at World War I. So again, in a nutshell, let's just sort of like pick up, and again, we know about this because you've done all about World War I. Okay, so Evans argues that the moment that war broke out in August 1914 is a crucial moment, okay, which historians need to understand. This is because the mood in Germany, we often call it the spirit of 1914, okay, is the mood in Germany in August 1914, in a way defined Hitler and the Nazi movement. Now, as you know, we will do more on this next lesson, Nazism was born out of the shock of defeat. And in large part, the greatest moment of Hitler's life, he often referred to it in his speeches, was that moment when all Germany stood together, the crowds were united, divisions were overcome. It was the beginning of World War I, in which the Kaiser said there are no parties, only Germans. So war created unity. And so the shock of defeat propelled Hitler into politics. And as a politician, every bone in his existence was about recreating the mood of 1914. And when he became leader of Germany, it was about that. And the mood of 1914, in which there was unity, was created by war. Okay, so war was good in Hitler's mind. And the other important thing that's sort of mentioned there is that World War One propelled into the limelight heroic military leaders like Hindenburg and Ludendorff, both of whom were close backers of the rise to power of Hitler. And what Hitler learned from that is that war created heroes who could lead, okay, and that what the country needed was heroic leaders. And he was deeply, deeply moved by that experience. And so again, when he became a politician and he became a leader of Germany in 1933, his whole understanding of what the country of Germany needed is it needed strong, heroic leaders to take Germany into better times. So all of these messages were born out of the early years of World War One, when the country was united and the war was being fought well and was being apparently won. So again, it's only a short paragraph there, but they're the points. Okay, so you can map those points to the actual text. There's a nice phrase, World War One was the catalyst. It changed the situation. Out of the shock of defeat, extremism now came to the surface. We know about the Bergfriede, the myth of the unity, the Kaiser declaring he recognised no parties, only Germans, and that mythical symbol of national unity, the spirit of 1914 that so motivated Hitler. And the emergence of Hindenburg and Ludendorff as mythical heroic figures. And of course, as I said, it was the greatest moment in Hitler's life. He stood in that crowd, and no matter what social class, working class or middle class or upper class, he looked around and said, war has brought us all together. It has overcome those class divisions. And later, many years later, someone actually saw Hitler in a photograph of the crowd, which of course is what is that famous picture is there. And there was Hitler in the crowd in Munich in August 1914. Picked out the greatest moment in his life, and everything that followed was about trying to turn the clock back to that moment. Okay, so we've covered the first big strand. We now move to the years of crisis, 1919 to 23. And in a nutshell, again, you know about this, but let's just make sure we're sort of clear. So the sort of shock of defeat, okay? What's this about? So Nazism was born in the shock of defeat, okay? So Hitler formed the Nazi Party in that crucial year 1919, when the country seemed to be teetering on the edge of a communist revolution, in which of course the Freikorps put it down. It never actually happened, but there was a horrible scare. And then the next 4 years were a time of crisis. So as we know, years of crisis, a time of national disaster, the shock of unexpected defeat, the real scare. It looked as if Germany was going to have a communist revolution. Fortunately, from the middle class point of view, the revolution was put down. But then 6 months later, the Treaty of Versailles, humiliation. Over the next few years, no support for Germany. It's like she was left alone by the Allies, abandoned to her fate. And then, of course, two of the Allies, Belgium and France, invaded Germany, invaded the Ruhr when Germany defaulted on reparations. And throughout the whole of this period, horrible economic problems, which all came together in an inflation, hyperinflation. The problem in this period was not unemployment. Actually, most Germans had jobs. The problem was rising prices, and of course, it all came together in 1923 with when money lost its value. So these were the years in which Nazism on the extreme right grew. They didn't take power. Hitler had a go in 1923, but it fell apart. The Munich Putsch. Hitler ended up in jail, but those seeds that had been perhaps planted way back in the Kaiserreich now started to sprout green shoots, and so Nazism began to grow. And the support for the Nazi Party in these early years was particularly from the middle classes, because they were the classes who lost confidence in the Republic for a whole range of reasons that we've already considered. And in particular, the middle classes associated democracy, of which there was so much hope at the beginning, with weak, indecisive government, with military defeat, with national weakness, and with economic chaos. So that's in another points that Evans makes in this particular paragraph, and it was only one paragraph. It's paragraph 4, so you can map those points across to the paragraph, but there they are. So national disaster, 1919 to 23 was a time of national disaster. Okay, it's where World War I had that its immediate impact. So the Treaty of Versailles united Germans in their resentment. So the Weimar Republic initially was very popular. Do you remember 76% of Germans backed it at the beginning when it was formed in January 1919? But then the Treaty of Versailles happened in June 1919, and by that point many Germans had lost confidence in the system. So there's the point about lack of support from abroad for Germany, and then France and Belgium occupied the Ruhr. Really the whole international economy, it wasn't just Germany, but across the whole world countries were not working together in terms of trade, and it wasn't really until the 1950s that we start to see a real recovery around the world. But in particular the German economy was in a state of crisis. Remember, the problem was inflation, not unemployment, okay, during these early years, peaking in 1923 with the hyperinflation. Okay, so there's our that strand. Now, the next one, again, you recognise it from GCSE, the mid-1920s, but remember this is A-level, so we've got to develop it to a higher level of understanding, the mid-1920s. So this is the period which on the surface appeared to be a time in which the Republic was getting its act together. It appeared to be a time of recovery, okay? But the reality was in fact far different, okay? The Nazis were not getting much support at that time. So it looked as if support was moving back to the middle of the spectrum, the parties that backed democracy. But the reality was actually very different. And the point is that the recovery masked deep problems that were just below the surface. And there were several of them. One, the economic recovery, so that's the first one, was, as you know, dependent on American loans, the Dawes Plan. So really, Germany was like a house of cards. It appeared as if it was rebuilding itself, but as soon as that money was pulled out, and it was pulled out in 1929 with the Wall Street crash, the whole house collapsed. But secondly, political weaknesses continued, masked by the recovery. So during that period of recovery, the Stresemann era, government was still coalitions. They often fell apart because of the constitutional weaknesses, proportional representation and so on. So governments were indecisive. Also, 3, the loyalty of many Germans was very tenuous. Their confidence, particularly of the middle-class Germans in the Republic, had been destroyed really in the early years. And so when the Republic seemed to be making a recovery in the mid-1920s, really the doubters, in particular the middle classes, they hadn't really been won over. So their loyalty was at best half-hearted. Okay. And fourthly, many Germans also reacted very negatively to the excesses of modern culture. Now, we touched upon that with women, do you remember? The Weimar Republic, it was like suddenly in 1919, Germany went from being a very authoritarian setup, where there was really very little real personal liberty, freedom, to suddenly huge freedom. All women had the vote in 1919. The Constitution guaranteed civil liberties. And so with that came lots of exciting cultural experimentation, brave and exciting new forms of filmmaking, of literature, art, architecture. It's like the Germans were like so excited with this freedom that many of them were very experimental. But actually, that created a backlash. Remember that term, reaction. Particularly the conservative classes, particularly the older generations, and particularly many German women, and particularly the lower middle classes, and particularly people in the countryside, very traditional in their views, didn't like, in particular, urban life, where it was all about bars and clubbing and modern films and stuff. And many of the conservative classes reacted against that. And it was these groups, that the middle classes, the women, the rural classes, and the lower middle classes, who unsurprisingly were the big backers of Hitler in the early 1930s. Okay, so that's it in a nutshell. And again, I've called it social fragmentation, cultural disorientation, political weakness. So again, I think all the points in a nutshell are covered there. So try to map them against the words in the text. So we're talking about, although the war now is more distant, it's still having an impact in the medium term. So the golden era was actually a time of disorientation. It was very confusing for a lot of people, in particular the middle classes and the women and the rural classes, etc. Didn't like it. Okay. Another point is the mid-1920s was a time of rising unemployment. Yeah, inflation was brought under control, but people started to lose jobs. And it's often the relation between inflation and unemployment. You can very rarely have them both down at the same time. So if you bring inflation down, often it causes unemployment to rise. And that was certainly a feature in the mid-1920s. And another thing is one of the strengths of the Weimar Republic is it did tax quite heavily, but it spent that money on welfare systems. So it looked after the Germans who couldn't look after themselves, the unemployed and the old and the sick. So quite strong welfare systems, but they needed to be paid for. And they were paid for by taxing German businesses. And German businesses were middle class. And middle class, as we know, never really bought into the Weimar Republic. It goes back to the first 4 years, the hyperinflation, where the middle classes lost their savings. And as we said, many of the middle classes didn't like the modern culture. And so these were the people who often felt that they were being forced to pay for the welfare of ordinary Germans. They didn't like it. And then you've got the political weaknesses, which we've already touched upon. Weak coalition governments often broke down elections all the time, even in the times of recovery. Constitutional weaknesses, and in particular, that old Article 48, which was fine. It worked really well. Remember, what Article 48 did is it allowed the head of state, the president, to step in to take emergency control. And if the president was in support of the Republic, such as Ebert, up until 1925, that was great. But in 1925, remember, Hindenburg himself, the great war hero from World War I, was elected as president. And at heart, Hindenburg did not like the Republic. He was a man of the Kaiserreich. And although it was his job to support the Republic, and on the surface his behaviour appeared as if he was, beneath the surface he was actually undermining the Republic. And it's no coincidence it was Hindenburg who appointed Hitler as Chancellor, and Hitler was fundamentally determined to bring about an end to the Republic. So Article 48 was misused. It worked well with the right president, but with the wrong president like Hindenburg, it didn't work well. So there we are. That's that particular strand. And the final strand then is, of course, the Great Depression, 1929 to 32, where it all sort of came together. And we'll spend a lot of time on this in the next 2 lessons when we look at Hitler. But what are the key points, again, in a nutshell, that you need to be aware of? Okay, so all this came together. The House of Cards collapsed when 1929, October, Wall Street crash, the Americans pulled out their loans to Germany and the House of Cards collapsed. It kind of exposed that the mid-1920s was a wafer-thin recovery, that there was latent hostility. Latent basically means deep-rooted, that goes back in time. 10 years earlier, back to 1919 to 23, many Germans, in particular middle-class Germans, had never really brought into the Weimar Republic. So the hidden hostility of 1919 to 23, which had disappeared beneath the surface, quickly came back to the surface again. And with a new economic crisis. But the thing is, this new economic crisis was the opposite of the earlier economic crisis. The earlier economic crisis, 1919 to 23, had been about inflation. This was a depression. And the key feature of a depression was the opposite of an inflation. Prices actually dropped. What went up was unemployment. Hundreds of thousands of German businesses folded. And what was exposed at the middle of it was the German government led by Chancellor Brüning. Now, he was the Chancellor from 1930 to 1932, and we'll do more about him in the next two lessons. But he had no response to the collapsing German economy other than to do nothing. His solution was to do nothing, and he was nicknamed the Hunger Chancellor. Now, in section C, remember, one of those common questions is about government intervention. Key thing you need to be making when you're writing answers to section C is that in the early 30s, there was no government intervention at all. He just simply hoped that normal market forces would kick in and that the economy would naturally improve eventually in the end. And the best government response was to do nothing. Now, that may have been the case, but it didn't make government popular. And within that context, Hitler was able to milk it and to win votes. So that latent, deep-rooted feelings that democracy wasn't working, all came to the surface between 1929 and 1932. And what it did is it led to, there's that word, polarisation of the national vote. The parties in the middle that believed in democracy and the republic, basically all their voters fled to the two extremes. On the unemployed working classes, many of them actually turned to the extreme left. So the Communist Party, the KPD, their votes went up enormously on the far left. But conversely, that created fear, particularly amongst the middle classes, because it raised that fear that, remember, had been there in January 1919 with the Spartacists. That fear of a communist revolution suddenly resurfaced again. The middle classes became desperately afraid. Whoa, if the communists take power, the middle classes would lose everything. So in that fear, the middle classes chose not to vote for the conventional parties on the political right, such as the German Nationalist Party. They turned to the radical right wing, the extreme right wing, and they looked to a new type of party that really could protect their wealth. And that party that emerged was the Nazi Party, proper name NSDAP, led by Adolf Hitler. But the final point is also important. Hitler's rise to power wasn't just about getting lots of votes. He also had that backing from the conservative establishment. In other words, the Junkers, the elites, the Prussian elites of the Kaiserreich, but also the industrialists. Now remember, in 1919, way back 10 years earlier, the Eber-Groener Pact, these people never really liked the Republic, but they were kept into their positions of influence, in particular in the army, in the civil service, in the judiciary, and in education. They were kept there by Eber. Why? To ensure that a communist revolution didn't happen in 1919. But what that basically did is it meant these people whose job it was to man the machinery that would make the Republic work, never really liked the Republic. So the machinery of the Republic was filled by people who, in the end, wanted the Republic to fail. And these small groups of powerful men who filled these key positions were the manipulators who put Hitler into power in January 1933. Okay, so those are our key points. Okay, again, you can map them against the paragraph. It's paragraph 6 of Evans, and just so you can map them. So World War I still having that long-term impact. There's the House of Cards of economic recovery, collapsed in 1929. What happened afterwards is polarisation. Both the left and the far right benefited. Political violence, fighting on the streets. These two groups, they didn't really bring, their fight was not in the Reichstag. A key feature of this period was violence on the streets between the two extremes. The moderate liberal centre were simply not getting the votes. Basically, politics had polarised. Old memories resurfacing. A lot of people talking about the lost spirit of 1914, and that's what Hitler milked in his election campaigns. And then there's that other point, the anti-republican bias of the conservative establishment, especially the army and the judiciary, was fundamental. Okay, so there's our big picture. Okay, and we've finished that. Lots there. It's only, as I say, 5 pages of evidence, but read through it again. Make sure you're comfortable with it. And a reminder of your flip learning for next lesson. I need to end the video now because the battery on my iPad is also going low, so I'll sign off now and save this video and put it onto YouTube for you. Watch out for another message, another Padlet for the next lesson, and then another video will follow in due course. Hope everything is okay. Just a reminder to those of you, you should by now have sent me your 4th essay, the Spartacist Section A question. Haven't had a chance really to go through my emails and collate all of that. I know I've had them, hopefully from everybody, but if you haven't done that, can you please make sure you do it as a matter of high priority? Email me your scanned essay. I don't really want to have to chase individuals on that. It's not the right thing to have to do. So make sure you address that. Thank you very much. I'm signing off now.